Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this episode of the Sarasota Bay Deep Dive series, where we interview people whose work has positive impacts on Sarasota Bay. My name is Darcy Young. I work with the Sarasota Bay Estuary Program in Sarasota, Florida, where we have a mission to restore and protect estuaries from Anna Maria Island down to the Venice Inlet. And my guest for this 8th Deep Dive episode is Dr. Emily Hall. Hi, Emily.
Hi.
And Emily is the manager of the Ocean Acidification Program and the Chemical and Physical Ecology Program at Mote Marine Laboratory and Aquarium, right here in Sarasota. Dr. Hall joined the staff at Mote Marine Laboratory in 2005, where she was most involved with research and monitoring of nutrient patterns in relation to harmful algal blooms in the west central coast of Florida and investigating sources of nutrients in aquatic systems. Dr. Hall has developed ocean acidification and climate change experimental systems both in the Florida Keys and here in Sarasota. She's focusing her research on unique coastal and marine habitats that may be able to withstand or alleviate the effects of global changes on organisms like corals, such as within seagrass beds or offshore deep holes, which are really cool. Dr. Hall is also an adjunct professor at Ringling College of Art and Design, and she's courtesy faculty at USF Sarasota Manatee, where she's taught chemistry and research methods courses. Welcome, Emily. It's great to have you on.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So you've had a really cool career, and you continue to have a really cool career in marine biology and chemistry. You get to do all sorts of awesome field work and lab work. So I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about how you got started in marine biology.
Oh gosh. Well, I actually grew up here in Sarasota. So I grew up being able to go out on the water all the time. My dad had a boat. He had a sailboat and a powerboat that we used to go out on. So I always loved being outside and in the water. And then when I went off to college, I was able to take a course, just an environmental science course. And it was one of the first science courses that I got to take that was outside, back in kind of that natural element. Trying to understand what was going on, especially with human interaction with our natural systems. And from then, I just knew I was going to go into an environmental science type world. I majored in environmental science, and then I went off to grad school and got my master's and my PhD in environmental engineering sciences. Prior to that, I had actually done an internship at Mote. Good reason for people to do internships. And funny, my internship at Mote, I was actually looking at the effects of the dissolution of shells from oysters and clams in chemistry. And that was before it was termed ocean acidification. So then, I went to grad school and then came back to Mote as a postdoc in the chemical ecology program. And then in 2012, started a new program at Mote called the Ocean Acidification Program. And now I'm back to both the chemical ecology side. I took that over after a colleague there retired and now running programs.
You're busy.
Yeah, a little bit.
So today we're going to focus on the ocean acidification side. And I've heard you call this phenomenon osteoporosis of the sea, which I think is so illustrative and such a good way of describing it. So can you tell us what's going on with OA?
Oh gosh, yeah. So just a little bit of background on ocean acidification. And you had a great video that you showed earlier when you were advertising this video. But it's basically related to the amount of carbon dioxide that we're putting into the atmosphere. And that carbon dioxide gets absorbed by the ocean, which is a good thing. Nature tries to keep a balance. It absorbs about 30% of that carbon dioxide, keeping it in the atmosphere. And it's good for some organisms, like phytoplankton, for example, that uses CO2 to produce oxygen. However, because of the amount that we're putting in the atmosphere and the rate that we're putting it in the atmosphere now, the ocean is starting to have to work overtime. So it's pumping more and more, basically, CO2. And we're starting to shift the chemistry, which is really kind of hard to do in a very high salinity type system because it's really hard. But we're causing the oceans to become more acidic because of more carbon dioxide going in at a faster rate, going into the ocean. Without getting too detailed into the chemistry, what it's doing is it's lowering the pH of our ocean, and it's causing there to be less available carbonate ions for things that need carbonate to grow skeletons or shells. And so comparing it to osteoporosis of the sea, what we're calling it osteoporosis of the sea, just like in humans where our bones can start to get more brittle and start to break easier due to osteoporosis, we see the same kind of things in some of our skeletons in the ocean and some of our shells. It's actually the higher acidity is dissolving, like literally dissolving some of those skeletons and some of those shells, causing them to be more brittle and more easily broken. A great example where we can see that is in corals, like especially branching corals, being much easier due to this kind of phenomenon.
Wow. Yeah. And so this is really widespread across the globe, right? It's a global phenomenon. And so you mentioned that, our oceans are absorbing about 30% of the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that we emit, right? So do you have a sense of how much more acidic oceans are today than they were, say, 100 years ago or so?
Yeah, it's about 30% more acidic than it was about 100 years ago, which is about the time of when we started burning things. The Industrial Revolution is when we started. When we go back and look at the data, it's really where we can start to see some dramatic changes and some dramatic shifts, unfortunately.
So you shared with me some good images of what acidification looks like on organisms, and I'm going to go ahead and pull those up so that everybody has a sense of what we're talking about.
Yeah, so I think the image that you're going to pull up is of corals. Because a lot of the work a lot of the initial work looking at ocean acidification was on coral reef ecosystems that are very sensitive ecosystems to environmental change. And this was published by colleagues of ours that we work closely with that do work in the Red Sea. And this is a coral species from the Red Sea. The coral that's posted under natural conditions is what it should look like in healthy present day conditions. The coral under the ocean acidification label is that same fragment of coral after it's been put in seawater that's representative of much, pretty far into the future, but future ocean acidification conditions. And what it showed basically is that the skeleton, that underlying part of that coral, has dissolved right out from underneath due to the change in carbonate chemistry. The animal is still alive. You can see it. It almost looks more like a sea anemone now than coral, but the problem with that is that now it's going to be more susceptible to fish bites, so it's maybe look more tasty to some fish, but also it's not going to form that same reef type structure, like big bouldering structure anymore. It's morphologically different. So that's a big problem, and this is a pretty powerful picture that shows it pretty dramatically. And if you click on the next picture, this is a coral species that's here in Florida, and in our backyards, at least down in the Florida Keys, and it's a coral that's listed on the Endangered Species Act list. This is our staghorn coral. The taller coral is the same species and genotype of that coral that's grown in present day conditions. The shorter one is the same species and genotype that was grown in ocean acidification conditions. So it just didn't grow. It was not able to take up those carbonates to put towards growing. So that can be detrimental as far as, especially in coral reef.
Right. So corals are, absolutely feeling these impacts. What other kind of organisms? You mentioned things with shells, but are there things that we might be more familiar with here in the Sarasota area that people might recognize?
Well, yeah, here in Sarasota, or around this area, there are a lot of shellfish, for example, clams and oysters and scallops. And we have been doing some research on that at Mote, and I have a lot of other colleagues that have done research on oysters and clams, and we're seeing some negative effects that these, especially in the juveniles, the baby oysters and clams, they're not growing as well And in fact, they start growing almost like malformed. They almost look like a melting wax in the juveniles. And so if they don't have the proper structure and that proper shell protection, that's not going to help them as they're trying to fight off predators or to have the right energy to find food, their own food, and those kind of issues. So there is a lot of concern in our areas with how ocean acidification affect, especially our shellfish, and the our shellfish industry partners have reached out to us and are asking a lot of questions about what to be looking for, and so there's a lot of emphasis in that, especially in our area.
So is estuarine acidification, the acidification that's happening in our estuaries, is that the same as what's going on in the open ocean? I mean, those are two very different systems. So I can imagine it might be happening a little bit differently.
Yeah, it's a little bit different, but it's also a little bit the same. But our estuaries are very complex ecosystems. There are a lot of influences hitting our estuarine systems. We have land-based stuff happening. We have the tides coming in and bringing open ocean type stuff in as well. And so we are seeing pH change. So let me back up a little bit. One thing with ocean acidification and the whole osteoporosis, one way that we look at it is we look at pH. So pH, or as ocean acidification is going up, pH is starting to drop. And people can relate to pH by thinking, a lot of people will test their pools, the pH, telling you how acidic or basic something is. And so a drop in pH, even if we're only seeing like 0.1 drop in pH, because it's on a logarithmic scale, it's actually a huge drop in how acidic or how much more acidic an environment. So I'm gonna use pH as an indicator of acidification. So pH changes in estuaries is more complex than open ocean because of things like runoff from land, other human impacts, currents, freshwater inputs. You can get other things that affect pH than just carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Another example is if we put excess nutrients into our estuaries, which that does happen in a lot of estuaries. Those excess nutrients will bring possibly more algae, more plankton, or more organic matter, even from rivers. And that organic matter, as it's getting broken down by microbial organisms, that's producing more carbon dioxide. So we get biological acidification in these estuary environments. So that on top of the acidification that we see a lower pH coming in with the tides and stuff, for example, you could have a double whammy of an acidic environment. It's also important because it can be potentially more concerning in our estuaries because we could see more of an immediate effect in kind of these slightly more enclosed environments. Health of estuaries and nearshore environments, as well as on our regional economies. Scallops, a lot of people in Florida love to go scalloping, and I know we have issues with other things with scallops in certain areas, but if they can't grow new shells, that's going to be an even bigger problem for them, and they have very short lifespans. So
right. How about freshwater bodies like lakes and ponds in Florida? We have a lot of those too. Are they experiencing the same kind of acidifying effects that our oceans and estuaries are?
Right, and that's a great question. They are definitely they are experiencing acidifying effects. They can. It's not as easy to quantify the effects of the anthropogenic or human-produced carbon dioxide coming down into those lakes because there's a lot of other things, again, with freshwater ecosystems that's different from saltwater ecosystems. There's a lot of different carbon fluxes or carbon changes in lakes, so it does make it, again, hard to quantify. But I know up in colder lake environments, up in like the Northeast, for example, they have a lot of acid rain up there, which drops down and can weather the rocks around it, and that can acidify those lakes. And there have been a few studies starting to really look at the change from atmospheric carbon dioxide on these systems as well.
Well, that'll be really interesting to follow for sure. I want to make sure our audience knows you can comment anytime with a question for Emily. We'll take it right here live. And, until we see some of those questions pop up, I'll keep rolling here. So we talked about shellfish, we talked about corals. I've heard you talk a little bit about how acidification might even be impacting fish. Would you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. There have been some studies, a great example, and I can't tell you who the authors are right at this moment, but there's been studies where people will take a fish and a predator of that fish and put them in a tank in ambient present day water, and the fish that's the prey swims away from the predator. That's normal fish behavior. They don't want to get eaten. But then they've taken those same fish and put it in an environment that's, that what we call ocean acidification or acidified environment. And the prey fish gets confused because of the drop in pH swims towards the predator. And it has a lot to do with the otoliths, so the bones in the ears of the fish. And so it's basically a biosensory issue. And so the ocean acidification doesn't just affect skeletons and shells and shellfish, that there are other behavioral things that are being affected. Even in corals, we've seen negative effects on some of the symbionts. So the organisms that live together in symbiosis with the coral can be affected by a change in pH. And so like energy shifts in these organisms start changing. And so like if you're a fish and you're confused and you swim towards predators, you're probably going to get eaten. You're not as hunting your prey. There's still a lot of research that needs to be done. There's a lot we don't understand. It's not easy to do research, especially on some of the bigger megafauna. We don't necessarily know what type of direct effect may happen on sharks or manatees or dolphin, for example, but we can at least look at what's going to happen to their food and to some of their ecosystems, which we know will indirectly affect some of those organisms.
Yeah. Okay, great. We've got a couple of questions rolling in here. Let's just take them in order. We got this one from Christine. She's wondering, if we stopped emitting carbon dioxide today, just completely, how long might we still see effects of ocean acidification in our oceans?
Yeah, that's a great and a very important question. And that's something that there are a lot of modelers that work directly on that question to try to understand what our levels are today in the atmosphere and the ocean. And if we could cut it off, there will be a lag time. And there are different scenarios, different models of the lag time. So I can't speak, directly on exactly how long it's going to take. But for a fact, there will be a lag time. So, what that kind of tells us is if we don't reduce those CO2 emissions now, and if we keep thinking we can keep waiting and waiting and waiting, it's going to get longer and longer and longer, because it does take some time for everything to kind of catch back up.
Right.
If there's a great report, if anybody in the public really wants to go and read it, the international panel on the IPCC, International Panel on Climate Change, has put out reports that talk about some of those models specifically, kind of, and they do it in a really good, easy to understand way. And it's going to be different in different parts of the world too, because, for example, ocean acidification happens faster in our colder climates than it does in our. So you're going to see kind of shifts and changes in slightly different time scales around the world.
And is it additive, where the more carbon dioxide that builds up in the atmosphere, the more is absorbed in the oceans and the more OA, or, does it work the same way like that?
Yeah, and again, but keep in mind, a lot of it has to do with the rate that we're putting CO2 in the atmosphere too, as well. Nature likes to the Earth likes to keep a balance. So it does work very hard to try to keep that balance of where carbon is and everything within our systems. But because we're doing things at a faster rate that some of our natural ecosystems can keep up with, that's where we're seeing that
Okay, great. We've got another question here from Wayne. And Wayne wants to know, how does ocean acidification impact harmful algal blooms? Does it make them more likely, more less likely?
That is also a great question. And that's actually a big topic that a lot of my colleagues and myself are looking at right now. There are a lot of theories out there, a lot of hypotheses about which harmful algal blooms may be negatively affected, which ones may actually be better competitively in a high CO2 world. Because you have to remember that plankton likes to take up carbon dioxide. It uses carbon dioxide for photosynthesis. But there hasn't been enough definitive research yet to say that this harmful algae is going to do really well in a high CO2 world, or this one is not. It's something we're working on. In fact, even government organizations like NOAA are very interested in this, and I think you're going to see in the next coming years like a big push towards this exact question. And this exact concern. And so, you know, I can say that there are a lot of theories, a lot of hypotheses. We are trying to test some of them. Like I have 2 experimental facilities, one here in Sarasota and one down in the Keys. And we're trying to see if we can look at, for example, Carenia brevis. We're trying to look physiologically and just its rates of photosynthesis and respiration in a high CO2 world. And it's not an easy organism to work with like that. So we are working towards that.
I think it's amazing, you know, just kind of as an offhand comment, what you can and what you are doing in the lab to try to simulate some of these ecological conditions that are just huge, you know. Maybe you can talk a little bit about some of the challenges of doing that in a lab environment, trying to kind of scale down from big to very small.
Yeah, sure. It's great fun. It helps that I have a little bit of the engineering school background, but it's trying to replicate what our future oceans are going to look like in a lab. It's not easy because there are a lot of factors that go into, for example, just taking Sarasota Bay. If I try to replicate Sarasota Bay in my lab at Mote, I have to take into account land runoff and human on a boat, and you know, all the fish and all the organisms and everything, and it's impossible. We try to narrow that down to kind of smaller questions and look more individually at different organisms or different groups of organisms. So I've, for example, the facility in Sarasota where I can actually bubble carbon dioxide into seawater. Create these future scenarios based on these models of the future, 50 years from now, 100 years from now, of where we think ocean acidification is going to be, and then we can grow some of our organisms like our corals or our scallops or our clams in that system, and kind of keep an eye on them, look for survival, look for behavior, or physiological differences. And again, this research has been going on for a little while, but there's still so much we don't know. And there's still so much more to keep looking towards. And that being said, I don't want this to be a total doom and gloom talk. We are also looking at ways to alleviate effects of ocean acidification. And we're doing it in those experimental facilities, as well as looking out in our natural environment. One good thing about a lot of our bays, especially like Sarasota Bay, is a lot of seagrass. And seagrass is so important for so many reasons. Obviously, it's a nursery, it's food for a lot of our organisms. It helps buffer the shorelines. Also, just like plankton, takes up carbon dioxide, and it photosynthesizes to produce oxygen. And so we think that the healthier our seagrass beds are, the better and stronger some of these estuarine environments will be as they become more acidified. Hopefully that makes sense. It's kind of a refugia for these organisms. And I don't know if you want to show, there's another picture on that slideshow.
Sure.
Where we actually bring seagrass into the lab and in an ocean acidification environment. And this is with some of our corals from the Keys, but we showed that a lot of those corals that were grown near seagrass were healthier and better off in the same ocean acidification environment in the same tank that did not have seagrass. So that's pretty strong evidence that a healthy background, a healthy backyard, a healthy ecosystem, like with a lot of seagrass and and healthy organisms are going to do better in a high CO2 world.
That's really cool. Another reason to love seagrass. So we're kind of honing in a little bit on this question of how will and how is ocean acidification impacting humans? We've done a lot of talking about how it's impacting ecosystems and organisms, but we humans are not being directly acidified, at least I don't think so. But of course we rely in a huge way on these environments. So maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, for sure. Ocean acidification absolutely is affecting us, whether you live next to an ocean or an estuary or not. So it affects the food we eat. I've already talked about like scallops, shell, clams, oysters, especially in the state of Florida. A lot of people like to eat seafood, and all around the world, obviously. There are quite possibly going to be socioeconomic costs with ocean acidification. I've already mentioned our clam and oyster industry partners. This could be a big negative for them. Ecotourism. So for example, down in the Keys, the Florida Keys, as our reefs are not doing as well, and if ocean acidification even hurts them even more, that's going to be a big loss to the state of Florida if we lose our coral reefs. Losing some of these ecosystems, or if these ecosystems become less healthy, the animals that depend on them are also going to become less healthy or have to find another way to survive. And so we're absolutely going to see changes. One of the other things I always like to talk about is a question that I ask the public a lot is, how many of you guys like to breathe? All of us, right? We like our oxygen. We need oxygen. And the majority of our oxygen now comes from the ocean. And so with ocean acidification, we could see loss of some of our oxygen producing organisms. We could see, we get a lot of oxygen from coral reefs, and we could see loss in that. And so it's really important to maintain healthy ecosystems. And it's important to make it just all around, like more and more people depend on the ocean than they know about, like absolutely, like all of our food sources. And but you're right, like if I go in the ocean, my skin's not going to burn my body from being too acidic. It's not that level of acidic, but our marine organisms are much more sensitive to these changes, and we are going to see major changes. We showed you that picture of that coral that started to look more like an anemone. And so we see less protection from hurricanes. Let's see, it's about to be hurricane season here. And a lot of those, at least our reefs that are calcium carbonate structures, if they start dissolving, we won't have a lot of that buffer, and we'll see higher storm surges and for waves hitting the coastline and stuff. So I mean, I could go on and on, but there are definitely a lot of different things that could be impacted.
Absolutely. And so you've hit on a couple of these so far, but are there critical steps that we need to take to help prevent further acidification and help protect the resources that we have now, and maybe try to either help them adapt to the acidification that's already going on?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd say, well, I've mentioned a couple of times, keep your backyards clean, and really, and when I say backyard, obviously, yes, your backyard at your house or your apartment or wherever, but I mean also like your community, Sarasota Bay. Like, we need to keep Sarasota Bay clean and healthy. The healthier it is, the better chance it's going to have against some of these more global impacts that are a bit hard to control. We can control a lot more things locally. Keeping it clean, keeping our seagrass beds healthy, but also reducing your carbon footprint to help keep your backyard clean. Reducing your carbon footprint, so many different things you can do. And there's a lot of things you can do without having to make huge major life changes. You can reuse water bottle, get a reusable water bottle, for example, is one way to do that. Ride your bikes more, walk more, carpool more, little things like that are pretty easy to take on. Plant trees, vegetation. So leading cause of ocean acidification right now is burning of fossil fuels, but other things that are causing it are things like deforestation. So our trees are plants that can take up that CO2.
Right.
So plant trees, have a little backyard garden if you can do it, and make it like, if you live in Florida, Florida friendly is the way to go, because then you don't really have to fertilize or overwater too. If you're like me and not great at keeping plants, Florida friendly is the way to go. And so, less nutrients, less excess nutrients into the bay. That's also important because, I mentioned biological acidification, and that'll help reduce some of those events. So there are a lot of things we can do. You just have to try. You can do it.
Well, cool. I feel like you've really helped bring this topic down to earth and close to home a little more, but not in a too scary way. Is there anything else we didn't touch on that you want to cover? Or audience, if you have any final questions for Emily, now would be a good time for those.
Well, I mean, one thing that, a lot of times when I talk about ocean acidification, it is kind of a doom and gloom. In the lab, we see a lot of negative impacts. In the field, we're seeing patterns of pH over time that has dropped, even in the Gulf of Mexico and some of our local estuaries. And so, and it's, I'm seeing this every day, but some people will ask, how do you stay positive about it? Well, you have to stay positive. And that's why we look for the things like the areas of refugia. We look for ways that we can alleviate. We are also finding that there are some organisms that seem to be less susceptible to ocean acidification, or some genotypes of corals, for example, that seem much stronger and more resilient to ocean acidification. So we know that there are some positives coming out of a lot of this, but we do have to take it seriously and consider, how we as people can reduce some of these impacts. It's hard to get a whole country to change behavior, but if you start by getting your neighborhood or your city or your county or your community, whatever, just making small changes that way, it's contagious. I promise you, it's very contagious when you see some of these changes happening. You can get your parents to change behaviors that are so used to old-fashioned ways of doing things. Again, lead by example, and lead and work with your kids. Your kids are probably learning a lot of these things in school too, and listen to them. They're learning good things. So it's important. So just keep your environment as clean as you can, and it'll help for sure.
Awesome. That's a good message to end with. And so I think with that, I'm going to go ahead and ask you your final question, which for those of you who have watched other deep dive episodes know what's coming. But I'm curious, Emily, especially since you grew up on the Bay and you spend so much time on it for work, do you have a favorite place on the Bay that you're willing to share with us that isn't a special fishing spot?
Yeah. Oh, gosh. Well, I love North Sarasota Bay, which is the area north of Ringling Bridge, up to the Bradenton area, that whole area, because there's so many unique little places and spots in there. And I'm not going to tell you my secret spots in the area, but I guess there's a couple of things too. I mean, I love being on the water in the Bay. I love that you can see so many animals, you can see so many happy people. And I love that being on a boat and every time you drive past someone, everybody waves. It's a great experience in Sarasota and brings the community together so well. Another thing that I love is I love running over the bridge, the Ringling Bridge. I'm a runner, and I have a lot of friends that run out there. So it's really great to see the views of Sarasota Bay from north to south. That's such a good high point to see it. And I count, going out into the Gulf as part of Sarasota Bay too, because it's so
Sure.
All the way out, even 40 miles offshore, which we didn't get to talk about, but maybe another time. There's some really, Sarasota Bay is such a cool spot. And it's so different from Tampa Bay or Charlotte Harbor, but I don't know. I can't pick just one thing. There's lots of great things about Sarasota Bay.
Yeah, I understand. I dread the day that somebody asks me that question. So, okay.
Awesome. Well, with that, I think we'll go ahead and wrap up this interview. Thank you so much, Emily, for joining us. I really enjoyed talking with you about OA, and thank you so much to our audience for joining us today as well. I think we're going to go ahead and post a couple of those resources that Emily mentioned in the comments if you're interested in reading about this further. Please join us back here next Tuesday. We'll be here again at 1:00 p.m. with Dr. Ernesto Lasso de la Vega. He is a volunteer with Sarasota Bay Watch. And if you enjoyed the shellfish parts of this conversation today, we're going to be talking all about shellfish next Tuesday, about Sarasota Bay Watch's clam restoration efforts in Sarasota Bay. So again, thank you so much for joining us. And thank you again, Emily. And we hope to see you next week. Bye-bye.